existential threat to the Jewish state as well as the West, Cohen sacrificed his credibility as a journalist. Even more, by using the helpless Jews of Iran as the linchpin of his campaign, Roger Cohen has behaved in a manner so shameful that his reputation as an apologist for those who threaten genocide may well live as long as Duranty's infamy. Jonathan Tobin in commentary. Quote, Cohen strikes me as one of those highly assimilated British Jews, yes, he came here and converted to being an American, who are made more than a bit nervous by Jews who have real Jewish commitments. Marty Peretz in the New Republic. Gary Rosenblatt in the Jewish Week probably summed things up most bluntly. Cohen has become our, quote, media enemy #1. So I thank you, Caltech, for inviting me. I thank you for having open minds. Debate is important. There was too little of it in the run-up to the Iraq War. When it comes to Iran and Israel, debate is often the first victim of zealotry. Many people have a lot invested in the view of Iran articulated this year by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, a messianic, apocalyptical cult. I do not agree, despite the terrible, the unconscionable brutality I witnessed in the aftermath of June 12. And I'll try to explain why today, as I examine those events of June, the American-Iranian relationship, and the issue of what policy the United States and its allies should pursue now. Well, I returned to Iran in June, just before the election, my third visit to the country, if you count my drive across Iran as an Afghanistan-bound hippie in 1973. But I won't dwell on that particular trip. A festive scene greeted me in Tehran, really an astonishing scene. You all know about Mir Hussein Mousavi's Green Wave, how it broke late, how it unfurled across the country, how it spurred fervent hopes of gradual change, led by a man, Mousavi, of impeccable revolutionary credentials, and kindled fears among hardliners of a, quote, velvet revolution. But perhaps you know less of how, in the days before June 12, Mousavi and Ahmadinejad supporters respected each other's rallies, engaged in vigorous debate, indeed astonishing debate, accusations of corruption, counter-accusations, letters from Rafsanjani to the supreme leader, documents being shown on TV, the kind of vigorous debate that you might find in this country or in Europe. It was really astonishing. Even on June 11, the day before the election, the so-called Day of Silence. This Day of Silence, at least in my observations of Iran that day, was almost impeccably observed. Posters came down right across the city. There was no campaigning. As I said earlier, the slow-forming contours of democracy have had time to take shape in Iran. This country, again, is ready. But Persian traumas related above all to security and independence run deep. And on June 13, all was changed utterly. Whatever the real numbers were, something was rotten in the state of Iran that morning of June 13. I was up pretty early. I was down near the Interior Ministry at 9:30. And it was an astonishing scene. This, remember, had been a city, a festive city, a city approaching what it believed, and a country approaching what it believed would be an open election. And out of the Interior Ministry, which was locked down, suddenly were pouring these pickup trucks with, in the back of them, these Robocop-like security forces carrying shields, batons, wearing helmets, pouring out into the streets. And they headed down toward the Mousavi headquarters, and I followed them. And even by 10 in the morning, the Mousavi headquarters had been turned upside down, ransacked. There were papers all over the floor, there were things burning, and these cops, who then, some of whom were on motorbikes, were going up and down. Tehran is a city of wide and beautiful avenues, like Baliasa, which is the Champs-Élysées of Tehran, these beautiful old plane trees, and narrow alleys that go between these magnificent avenues. And on this alley where the Mousavi headquarters are, the police were just going up and down in phalanxes, and anybody who stood or loitered was just beaten. And for the first time, it became a very familiar sight. I saw women bleeding from their heads who had just been savagely beaten in the street for doing nothing more than loitering. And there were trucks going by and police with megaphones, and they were going, you over there in the blue shirt, you over there in the hat, move now. If you don't move, you're going to see what will happen. And I have never, in 30 years as a journalist, seen such an absolutely hallucinatory transformation of the atmosphere of a city overnight, where the streets had been full of summer ease and the sweet breath of freedom. Now they were full of fear and menace. And a young woman came running toward me and said, put down your notebook, come help us. And she was crying. And it seemed that some sinister puppet master had suddenly decided that the entertainment was over, that everything that had happened had just been one big game. Well, what is one to make of this? And I think one basic point that needs to be made is that it's the responsibility of a state holding an election to satisfy its citizens that the vote is fair, not the obligation of those citizens to prove that the proceedings were fraudulent. And the Islamic Republic failed in this. It failed utterly, as the millions of protesters on the streets demonstrated. A system that has the vote tally done by a group of regime officials inside the Interior Ministry, and then arbitrated if necessary, and it proved to be, because even the Supreme Leader said maybe 3 million votes were dubious. That's, 7%, 8% or something, by a body, the Guardian Council, that's also stuffed with loyalists, is not one ready to give the final say to the second word in that self-description, Islamic Republic. In other words, to the people. That's the very least that can be said. And a fundamental question arises. If you've won a massive victory, if you've won by 2/3 of the vote, if you've won 63%, why do you respond to that by putting into effect what was, to all intents and purposes, a putsch? And the experience of 1997 and Khatami, previous reformist election, had given many Iranians the sense that the word republic did mean something, and that they could nudge the system this way or that. There was a difference between Khatami and Ahmadinejad, and that they could alter the balance, and that so this word republic was not meaningless. And I think the experience of 2009 shattered those notions, and that is a very significant shift. Look, nobody knows what the exact votes were. I mean, a few people do, but they're not going to tell us. But I'm prepared to, I'm sure, in fact, that Ahmadinejad got a lot of votes. He did not get 25 million votes. He got 5 million votes in the first round in 2005. At a time of great economic difficulty, he did not jump to 25 million votes. It's quite possible there could have been a runoff, but there's no question in my mind that, in essence, the regime panicked. It panicked in the final days. And this is what happened. You don't invite 500 journalists to Tehran to witness an election, and that's what happened. But this is what you're planning. And then turn around on June 13 and try and throw those 500 journalists out of the country. I mean, that, as I said, the Islamic Republic is not dumb. I mean, it's not. They try to plan things cleverly. This was a mess, and it remains a mess. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Well, let's move forward 3 days. Monday, June 15. A day I'll never forget. I'll never forget any of this. Really, I mean, all my experience as a journalist, I was saying this earlier, this was in the 3 or 4 most powerful experiences that I've ever had, and I can't, frankly, get it out of my head. Anyway, on June 15, from Enkelab, that's Revolution Square, to Azadi, Freedom Square, from revolution to freedom, which is a distance of several miles. People, as far as the eye could see. I mean, I managed to get up on an overpass, which was shaking from the number of people on it. And I looked back to Enkelab, and I looked forward to Azadi. I couldn't see the beginning or end of it. And Meir Khalibaf, who is no particular friend of the opposition, a moderate conservative, close to Khamenei, his office later estimated the crowd at 3 million people. And this crowd moved with a dignity and a strength that was quite astonishing. Every single one of them, like myself, had gone down to that avenue full of fear. We'd seen people beaten. We'd seen people bleeding. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how many people would be there. And when you join a crowd of millions of people, something interesting happens. Fear evaporates. The force is with you. You can kill. How many people were killed at Tiananmen Square? You can kill 100 people. You can kill 300 people. You can't kill 3 million people. And I've asked myself, and I wrote a column about this the other day, I asked myself the rather useless but interesting what if question ever since. You know, what if that crowd had wheeled and walked toward the presidential palace? What if Mousavi had said, "Here I stand and here I will fall"? What if? I can tell you this much. Iran was on a razor's edge. For about a week, Iran, the Islamic Republic, was on a razor's edge. It could have gone any number of different ways, but for a week at least after the election, the regime did not have a handle on a situation that broke upon it with the force of a massive wave, and for which they were unprepared. And in this crowd, people walked in silence. You heard people saying "sukut, sukut," which means quiet, quiet. And they marched with their arms raised, making victory sign. Old and young, shopkeepers, students, South Tehran, North Tehran. Anybody who tells you this was just the North Tehran bourgeoisie, it's nonsense. People I talked to had been in rallies in 1979, marched in the revolution. There were women trying to get the police, did sit and watch until some shooting toward the end of it, but there were women talking to the police and saying, trying to get them to stand up and join in. I saw some of the police smiling. And it was an incredible and intensely moving scene. And the people of Iran simply rose up. They didn't rise up at that moment to overthrow the Islamic Republic. They rose up because their votes had been stolen. That's what they believed. And they wanted their votes counted. It was as simple as that. The more you look at the Ahmadinejad numbers, the more incredible they become. As you know, this line just went like that. I mean, there was no variation. It was, you know, in the mid-60s, from first to last, across areas of completely disparate social and ethnic makeup. Poor Karoubi, who got 6 million votes in 2005, went down to 300,000. His newspaper the next day said, the Interior Ministry says Karoubi came in 5th and had the scores and the spoiled ballots.